Hey again, this is Dr. Lee in the house with you. We'll call this recording Chapter 5, Part 3, and here we'll have an explication of Marxism. Let's start our understanding of Marxism by saying that it is the intellectual brain. Well, let's say it comes out of the writings of Karl Marx here and Frederick Engels in 1848. 1848, Marx and Engels put together a short pamphlet that lands with a thundering thud of dominant ideology. It's called the Communist Manifesto. Some of the famous phrasing from there have seeped into popular culture. You probably know them, right? Hitherto, rather, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Maybe you've heard of that, right? In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, 1848, say, let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So let's talk about Marxism here, and we'll just push through what we would have done in a class setting. We'll push through it this way. Marxism holds that society is fundamentally divided into classes, where there is class conflict between the two most opposite classes, the ownership class, the bourgeoisie, and the labor class, the proletariat. This class conflict is a recurring feature of human history, and part of the result is that it features periodic revolution. So society will continue to operate in this awful cycle until something happens that interrupts this trend towards revolution based on economic circumstances and leads the way towards a class-less society. Should this occur, the state then needs a centralized vanguard to stop class conflict with the ultimate goal of producing socialism. And because imperialism is class conflict on a global scale, then this vanguard must be worldwide as well. Just some introductory comments into what we mean when we say Marxism. Now, because this is part three of a discussion of, political ideologies, let's compare liberals and conservatives and to Marx on one, the basis of their metaphysical assumptions. You'll remember that the liberal says that you were born with natural rights and you get these natural rights from God, and from these natural rights it gives forth natural reason, and natural reason produces the laws of nature, which leads to limited government that has as its economic expression capitalism. That's what the liberal says. The liberal then says that God gives individuals inalienable natural rights. You remember we saw conservatives from Edmund Burke to Russell Kirk say that God has ordered society in a series of long-standing traditional relationships, that it is God that makes society organized in particular ways. The Marxist, right, takes these liberal and conservative notions of God and throws them out the window. The Marxist says, wait a minute, you cannot possibly know what God has ordained. Let's look at let's compare the assumptions of the liberal and the conservative and the Marxist on the state of life and the state of nature. You will recall with me from the chapter 1 discussion, we looked at Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and said that life in a state of nature is life before government, where people are just individually competitive as they look to manifest their natural God-given rights. So for the liberal, men exercising their liberty will be ultimately chaotic, possibly bestial, maybe even will be savage. And so this rationality for the liberal essentially leads to the requirements of limited government. The conservative says life in a state of nature is not necessarily life before government, but is traditional man organized into traditional groups that have organically evolved into governmental structures. The Marxist looks at the liberal and the conservative on the notions of the state of nature, and the Marxist just shakes his head. The Marxist says life in a state of nature is the evolution of man in various stages of economic development, various stages of economic organization. Engels said nature is the proof of dialectics. Nature works dialectically, not metaphysically. God didn't come down, right? So if Engels is going to tell us that nature is the proof of dialectics, we should then look to understand what is meant when the Marxist says dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is a compound term, so we should be able to break it down, right? One of your most famous, most well-versed rappers, right? One of your hip hop defining personalities, KRS-One. He once said that we have to, right, if you're looking at a compound term, KRS-One said you have to break it down to its very last compound to see how it sounds, whether or not it's rational. Break it down to its very last compound. So let's go and let's define dialectics. Let's define our terms. Dialectics involves the interaction of conflicting ideas, the interaction of opposing groups, the relationship between opposing phenomena, right? So the interaction of conflicting phenomena. Dialectical understandings are those that are cognizant of the complexity of human life. This is something that the conservative agrees with also. Yet the Marxist reaches different conclusions in regard to theory and in regard to science. So a dialectical understanding as put forward by a Marxist is to argue that it is only by being scientific in your analysis that you can truly understand the conflicting phenomena, the conflicting ideals and groups, or the key dialectics at work. Conservatives, when you read your Russell Kirk, even read your textbook, conservatives are specifically anti-theoretic, right? Anti-intellectual to some degree, but anti-theoretic, right? So the dialectic says that, the Marxist says that it is only by being scientific in analysis that you can truly understand the key dialectic at work. The dialectical method then looks at the logical and historical process of events, sees these as constituted by opposing or conflicting elements or phases. Each conflict eventually overcome by a new union. If you want to get the dialectical method in one sentence, it is this. You have the thesis, and then you have the antithesis, and then they come together, they conflict with each other, and ultimately they form a new synthesis, which produces a new thesis, again produces its antithesis, where they both again come together to form a new synthesis, out of which will emerge a new thesis, which gives birth to its economic antithesis, and both of those forces again conflict to again produce a new synthesis, which produces a new thesis and antithesis. So out of each new synthesis, its own opposite arises, and in turn, a new dialectical conflict emerges, which must lead to yet another synthesis, and so on and so on and so on. These are the wheels. This is the wheel that drives history forward. So the dialectical method says only through this understanding, can the inexorable spiral-like development of historic and present world events be fully appreciated. Now, compound phrase, not just dialectics, but we're looking at dialectical materialism. What do we mean by materialism? Materialism then is focused on the concrete concerns of human needs and wants, right? Someone who's concerned with materialism is looking to cope with the various forces at work as human beings have developed in their societies. The materialism has as an effort to analyze the development of human society as it attempts to satisfy the material needs of conflicting classes. This effort here is to assert that history can only be understood as the development of human societies attempting to satisfy their material needs, the material needs of conflicting economic classes, materialism. So when you put it together, we said dialectical, the dialectical method is to look at the conflict that occurs between opposing phenomena, the dialectical method. We're saying that materialism then is the effort to understand the development of human society as it attempts to satisfy the material needs of economic groups, classes that are in conflict. So now KRS-One told us, let's break it down to its very last compound and see how it sounds. How does it sound? Dialectical materialism then may be defined as understanding the full range of human interactions and socio-economic development as what? As the conflict of competing classes, as each class attempts to satisfy their material needs. Dialectical materialism. According to Marx and Engels, according to the Marxist frame of applied theory, dialectical materialism is the only way to understand world history. If you're looking to focus on what it does, rather, is it focuses on the nature of class struggle and class conflict and sees it as a key, core, fundamental, defining element of social and economic development. At this point, I'd be remiss if I didn't say a word of comparison between the ideas of Marx and the ideas of the German philosopher Hegel. Remember that Hegel is anterior to Marx. And so when Hegel comes up with the notion of dialectics, he's talking about something that specifically lives in the realm of ideas, right? And what Marx does is he brings the ideas down to the material world, right? What Hegel looks to do is he emphasizes the concept that the idea is the thing. The idea is the thing that matters. There is matter, and matter is everything, but matter is merely an idea where the idea is composed of conflicting phenomena like dark, hot, cold, that kind of thing. What Marx does is he says, yes, this ideal nature of reality is true, and it also is true in the material world. So what we understand as dialectical materialism represents Karl Marx providing a certain amount of modification to the ideals of Hegel. I just figured we'd say that. Let's keep on going. If we're going to understand dialectical materialism as applied theory or as something that governments can do, then we need to clarify, we need to define our terms. We are going to say that, remember, dialectical materialism says that society is composed of competing classes. Okay, so a class is a group of people that are defined by their proximity to the means of production. There are certain people, remember in the discussion on chapter 4 and also in chapter 5, part 2, we looked at the writing of Plato, we looked at the writing of Aristotle. Remember, we saw then that people are ultimately divided into groups, and the economic groups they're divided into are based on their relationship to how things are produced, right? I'm trying to say it a different way and can't. And so what that means then that some people are going to be workers, and then some people are going to be owners. And so by means of production, relationship to means of production, that means we're talking about all of the elements that are essential to develop, to produce, and to sell goods and services in the economic marketplace, where a marketplace is defined as the place where producers and sellers, where buyers and sellers interact and interact with each other through prices that are set by economic self-interest, according to Adam Smith. So you think about, for example, how does one make your favorite cell phone? Cell phones have copper, nickel, palladium, tantalum, gold involved in them. Where does this stuff come from? Somebody's got to dig it out of the dirt. And then ultimately, who composes these elements into a particular cell phone, and then who sells that cell phone for an extended profit. The person that owns the company that makes the cell phone is of a different class than is the person who digs in the dirt to extract copper and nickel out of Mother Earth, right? So we're talking about the economic class is defined by your relationship to the means of production. Now, on the nature of society, the liberal, the conservative, and the Marxist says that society is composed of different groups. Where the Marxist says society is composed of classes who conflict in a dialectical fashion, the liberal says society is composed of individuals, and these individuals are in competition with each other. Compare that to the conservative, where the conservative says society is composed of groups, and the structure of the group should be time honored by tradition and thus should not change. Well, remember, all right, so that's good. So Marx tells us then that a class is a group of people defined by their proximity to the means of production. So for Marx, there are 5 core economic classes. And remember, when we go through this, he's talking about classes in the European industrial sense, not classes as they would exist. Well, matter of fact, let's say it that way. 5 classes according to Marx. On the one hand, you have the people that own the means of production. Let's say we're talking about making my favorite cell phone. This is my Galaxy something or other, and it comes from Samsung, right? So who makes Samsung? The person that owns, or the people that own Samsung Corporation, that those would be the bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie are the people that manage the affairs for the bourgeoisie, but the petite, the petty, the small bourgeoisie, these are people who fundamentally do not own the means of production, but they do have an exalted position in the economic hierarchy over the proletariat. Petty bourgeoisie tend to be the managers of certain corporations, right? The proletariat are those who sell their labor power for wages, people that are deeply involved inside the capitalist economic system, yet their involvement in that system is to be a source of labor. And they sell that labor power in the hopes of getting wages, paychecks that they can use to satisfy their material needs. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat are the groups that are in fundamental conflict with each other, where we earlier said that the key dialectic at play is between thesis and its economic antithesis that conflict with each other to produce a new synthesis. While we said that is what the dialectical method is, well, the key classes in conflict with each other are the bourgeois class, the thesis, its economic antithesis is the proletariat class, and they, as we'll see in a second, they will have a clash. The proletariat will revolt, and out of that revolution will produce a new synthesis. Now, what I was saying a second ago is that this is something that is fundamentally true for the European context. Another class, according to Marxists, would be lumpen proletariat. These are people who sometimes sell their labor in the, let's say, the orthodox economy, yet they often remain outside that orthodox economy, black market affairs, right? So there are some people in this world who have jobs and they work in various positions for a corporation, and then these people buy some drugs and sell those drugs illegally out of, let's say, the trunk of their car, right? So on one hand, that person does have a job, so he's inside the orthodox economy, but then on the other hand, that person is making money outside that orthodox economy. So that's what we call the lumpen proletariat. And then lastly, according to Marx, there's the peasantry. These are people who do have certain material needs to satisfy, but they do so largely outside the orthodox economy. These are people that are outside the industrial labor-based economic cycle. So depending on where you're living, what part of the world you're talking about fishermen, farmers, herders, that kind of thing. All right. As we look to understand the key dialectic at play, there's a certain amount of terms that we have to use in order to get our arms wrapped around what Marx and Engels are ultimately saying to us, right? What really is key to Marxism. The key dialectic at play is the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That is the economic thesis and the economic opposite, or the economic antithesis. So what the Marxist says is that the proletariat is paid less than the value of the things that they produce. Fundamental. The bourgeois class then benefits from the surplus value that's generated by the economic cycle. This results in material exploitation, because in the fact that the proletariat is paid less than the value of the thing that they produce, this generates in the lifestyle of the proletariat misery and suffering, want, and psychological as well as economic poverty. Because the economic system produces society at large, society then reproduces the power dynamic, the key dialectic at play in the economic system. So religion, culture, the art, and even the law itself, these are merely a smokescreen, according to Marx, to keep the ruling classes in power. Life in a society organized around dialectical conflict is essentially a collection of habits that serve ultimately to keep the ruling classes in power. You will note with me that the Marxist understanding is a fundamental critique of capitalist development. Let's define our terms. Alienated labor. This is a relationship that Marx makes plain for us. Excuse me. Alienated labor begets surplus capital, because you have lots of work and then you have less pay, right? Remember, we said that labor, or the proletariat, is paid less than the value of the thing that they produce. This results in surplus value, which generates profit accumulation for the bourgeois class. This is what we can term as exploitation. Alienated labor is another key term in this thought. Alienated labor is the process whereby workers are stripped of their very humanity by the nature of their work for the benefit of the ownership class. If we were doing this in person, I would tell you guys a story. And so I don't think it's too much of a problem to put this story in this video. Long time ago, when I was working my way through graduate school and my children were young, I would teach during the morning hours, and then I would be the electronics guy at Target during the evening hours, working those jobs, making sure the kids had their stuff, right? And so this one time I'm working the electronics section in the Target, and I was carrying a box of, this is how long it was ago, a box of CDs and VHS tapes. I was carrying them from the back of the store to put them up on the shelves. Surprisingly, without any forewarning, because I wasn't feeling ill before that, something just overcame me and I just threw up. I just called Earl all over that box of stuff I was carrying. The manager of that section of Target, he rushes over to me and he doesn't ask me how I'm doing. He doesn't say what's wrong. He doesn't express any concern for my physical well-being. He was like, what in the world are you doing, throwing up all over those CDs? What's wrong with you? He was more concerned with the merchandise that I was carrying than he was concerned with my physical health. And then just to conclude the story, what he ultimately told me was, go in the bathroom and clean those things off and put them back on the shelf. Right? So be careful out there. I always say that. So I offer that story to you to explain what it looks like, what alienated labor looks like. We'll do some Engels in a second. But again, alienated labor is the process whereby workers are stripped of their very humanity, where they are seen as less valuable than the work that the machines or the goods that they are working on or that they are producing. Okay, let's define surplus labor. Surplus labor in its simplest form means work that is done beyond what's necessary to sustain the worker. Work that is way above what the worker needs to do to live and survive or to satisfy their material needs. Surplus value then is the difference between the lower cost of production and the higher cost at market. Trying to leave it nice and simple. We'll leave it at that. And so the surplus value, the cost, the difference between lower cost of production and the higher cost at market, right? If you're gonna make a chair and it costs you $5 to make that chair, yet you sell that chair for $25, then you've got $20 of surplus value, if I can say it in a blunt form. So surplus value then leads to profit accumulation. The greater profits for the bourgeoisie leads to greater investment in the productive process, which leads to the need to further alienate labor, right? We know that they're going to buy fancy and fun things for themselves. But in the best case scenario, the capitalist takes surplus value that comes from surplus labor. It's going to take that surplus value and reinvest it back into the productive process. And because you're reinvesting, that means you are continuing the cycle of labor exploitation that's at the heart of capitalist development. This is what Marx is saying. So this drive for profit accumulation, it has no end. It is insatiable. It causes capitalists to exploit the home countries that they live in and then move forward to exploit other places. Capitalism then has a like a necessary component to become imperialism. That's what Lenin told us. Okay, so now let's approach Marx's work written in 1867. I always remember when Das Kapital was published because 1867 is the founding year of my alma mater, Morehouse College. Das Kapital, here you have, okay, well, in 1848, you have Marx and Engels penning the Communist Manifesto. But by 1867, Karl Marx had matured his understanding into dialectical materialism, quite well matured, right? All right, so in Das Kapital, Marx says that capitalism is a fully functioning economic system, but it is fragile at its heart, right? This is what we're taking from it. In a system that's based on profit that's extracted from human beings who have human desires and such, there's got to be some limits. The working day can only be so long. There's no limit. There is a limit to how much work one person can do. That means then that there's a limit to how much surplus value can be extracted by the system. And because there is a limit on surplus value, and because the drive to accumulate profit is insatiable, there has to be innovation and the creation of machines to make the work more efficient. This introduction of machine labor into the productive process will serve to squeeze out workers. Machine labor versus human labor often creates the interruption in the accumulation of profit because the exploited worker cannot go on at the rate that's necessary to sustain the system, right? And so from Das Kapital, we can turn our attention at least to Engels' specific contribution to our understanding of dialectical materialism, where Frederick Engels helps Marx mature his views on theory of alienation, right? So alienation, right, the theory of alienation says that people are seen as less valuable than the machines that they work on. Human beings then are understood to lose their agency, lose the ability to be self-determinate, autonomous, or to be people that can realize themselves on the material world. And because of this, that means that people will want to do something to create agency for themselves. The predicate supposition here is that human beings are not born to live in subjugated circumstances forever. The drive of the capitalist to create profit accumulation based on the backs of an exploited labor is fundamentally exploitative, right? And because there's exploitation, and because the proletariat class will always outnumber the bourgeois class, there's always going to be more poor laborers than there are wealthy owners, then that means that there's an inevitability towards revolution. And so material exploitation, the theory of alienation, right, holds that material exploitation due to the development of surplus value and profit accumulation, this must bring on the possibility of revolution. It must produce revolution. For Marx and Engels, revolution is inevitable because it's the result of capitalist development. Liberals, similarly, remember your social contract theory is that if people allow government to exist so government protects their rights, but if the government violates instead of protecting their rights, then the liberal says people have the right to revolt and overthrow that government. So on this point, the Marxist and the liberal agree that revolution is inevitable. However, they're going to come from different sides of the street. The conservative sees the very notion of revolution as counter to God's favor. This is something that's evil. This is something that should never occur, and revolution should be avoided at all costs. The revolutionary indeed should be marginalized, if not killed, all in the favor of allowing traditional society to engage in gradual change. So for Marx, revolution is inevitable, is the inevitable result of capitalist development, and that then means that the Marx believes that capitalism is beset by internal contradictions because it produces the very thing that will destroy it. That capitalism produces exploited labor will rise up and overthrow the capitalist system, beset by internal contradictions. Let's walk through it this way. Marxism holds that capitalism is based on exploitation. This exploitation will produce revolution. Capitalism, in that it produces exploitation, is thus beset by an internal contradiction because it creates the very thing that will destroy it. There are numerically more poor people than there are wealthy people. There's more proletarians than there are bourgeoisie. So when this revolution occurs, by sheer numeric advantage, the proletariat will win. Pause button. We're having this discussion in the backdrop of June 2020, the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. The night before I did this recording, what I mean to say is just last night, in reaction to the police killing of Rayshard Brooks outside of a Wendy's here in some part of Atlanta, that Wendy's was burned down, right? And so the country is already upset at the murders of, Breonna and, George Floyd and the like, right? And so you have another murder where, Rayshard Brooks, he struggled with the police officers, apparently somehow got the taser out of the police officer's hand. He was running away and the police officers shot him in the back, right? Now, I offer that to you because remember, we're saying that capitalism will produce a revolution. And this is something that liberals will agree, that liberals will produce a revolution. All right, now let me get back to the point. Where the Marxist says that if there's this revolution, then the proletariat will win, right? And so look at this last point. The Marx says that the bourgeoisie is a sorcerer who creates that which he cannot control. So read this with me. Now, on this next slide, I want you to please I want you to write these things out. Draw a picture. This is how you really lay claim to what the Marxist is saying, right? Draw a picture of it, right? using, the letters of each of the words. All right. So ultimately, how does a Marxist think society works? This is what we're saying in conclusion. In dialectical terms, there is an economic thesis and which produces its opposite, the antithesis. This economic thesis and antithesis, they must come into conflict. Then the economic antithesis, meaning the proletariat class, the economic antithesis will win. They will replace the bourgeoisie and they will give birth to the new economic relationships, right? So in order to survive this new bourgeoisie, let me say it this way. I'm gonna use my hands. I can't figure out how to draw on the screen and make it look any way legible. You have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? The proletariat is underneath the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie depends on exploiting the proletariat to have its profit. The proletariat then is exploited. They will have a revolution and they will fight the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. The proletariat, because they have numerical strength, not only will they fight, but they're going to win. And when they win, this proletariat then will become the new bourgeois class, because they only are able to survive at the top of the economic system because they're going to give birth to their own economic antithesis. When the new proletariat then gives birth to a group of people that they can exploit, the proletariat then have become the new bourgeoisie. This new bourgeoisie gives birth to a new proletariat that is exploited. They will have a revolution, and the new proletariat will take over from the bourgeoisie. This new proletariat will then become another set of bourgeois actors, because this new bourgeois actors, they only want to stay on top because they can produce, they can exploit rather, a third form of proletariat class. And these people will be exploited and they will revolt, and this thing will happen on and on and on and on again. In order to survive, then, the victors of the revolution must give birth to their own economic antithesis, which will be exploited, it will revolt, and it will win, thus again replacing and becoming the new thesis and necessarily giving birth to its own antithesis. This is what Marx calls the cyclical nature of class conflict, that this thing is going to happen on and on and on and on and on until a true paradigmatic shift occurs, where classes end, where classes cease to be the dominant form by which socio-economic dynamics are occurring. And this new area, this new paradigmatic shift, this is what the Marxists calls socialism. Okay, so that was chapter 5, part 3, where we talked about Marxism. All right, I'll see you at the next one. Peace and hair grease.